So I'll just do some introductions. I'm a curator of contemporary art across the road at Tate Modern. My name is Catherine Stout, and I'm also co-founder of the Drawing Room with Kate and Mary. I'm very delighted to welcome a distinguished panel for this discussion. On my left, we have Grant Watson, who is Senior Curator at Innova in London and also Research Coordinator. Catherine Lambert, now Independent Curator and Art Historian, formerly Director of the Whitechapel Gallery from the late 1980s until 2001. And here, as I'm looking at the audience, I think many of you were at the Drawing Room last night for Christian Ratama's fascinating lecture. He is, for those who don't know, the Associate Curator of Drawing at Museum of Modern Art in London, and recently curated an exhibition, Compass in Hand, in New York, sorry. Everything is to do with London.
Everything is in London.
Everything is in London, yeah. And recently curated Compass in Hand from the Judith Rothschild collection, gifted to MoMA in New York. So what I think we're going to do, given that people did hear Christian's talk last night, is to ask Grant and Catherine to do give a very brief sort of introduction to some of the projects they've worked on. What we're hoping to discuss in this sort of panel is drawing as a means to engage with the context in which the work is made, whether that's a fixed location or on the move, but also I think drawing as a tool to sort of transcend ideas of nationalism and geography and the thematics. I'd like to maybe bring economics into the discussion at some point, I think, in terms of ideas of movement of artists, and also I think possibly there's a relevance to curating today as a nomadic practice in different centres. But let's see how the discussion goes. I think we start the presentations and then sort of expand to a discussion, and then hopefully allow time to have a good discussion from the audience and leave on time for lunch. So can I ask you, Grant, to,
Okay, so when I was asked to do this panel, Kate suggested that I talk a bit about Nazreen Mohammadi, who's an Indian artist who was born in 1937 in Karachi, moved to Bombay when she was about 4, trained in London and in Paris, and then returned to India in the 60s and sort of pretty much stayed there, and was a teacher at one of the most important colleges in India, which is Baroda. And she died in 1990 and sort of, in a way, sunk a little bit out of visibility. And there's been a sort of slow process of kind of her emergence as an artist over the last 10 years. And I've been quite involved in working with her practice over that time. I think perhaps the first thing to say, when I read the catalogue essay, I was trying to kind of figure out the relationship of her work to some of the themes in the exhibition. And of course, immediately there's a contradiction, because Nazreen's work is very much about kind of stillness and stasis, and it's a kind of very contemplative and meditative process that she was engaged in terms of constructing her works. She was very much a studio artist, so she almost kind of fetishized the space of her studio, which she kept virtually empty, with just a few sort of tools that she used to produce her drawings with. And she worked very slowly, so there wasn't this sort of sense of speed and quickly works that developed quickly and sort of in response to particular situations and places. I mean, she worked incrementally and she built up her drawings. Maybe we should actually go to another drawing. I don't know, it's probably called number 1. It's the next one. So you can see that the drawings are built up incrementally using pencil and pen. And she stuck with certain kind of formats for long periods of time. So almost throughout the whole period of the 70s, she was making works that were sort of based on the grid, but sort of deviating from the grid slightly. And then in the 80s, she moved to, if you can just show the next image, she moved to these sort of more free-floating geometric forms, often working with diagonal. But I suppose to then sort of try and fold her into some of the sort of themes of the exhibition and the conference, I think it's very interesting actually picking up on your point when you were talking about the lady here who made the point about parallel practices, and I was really struck by the striking parallels between some of the sort of aesthetic forms in the work of Lydia Pape and something like this, for example, and some of the sort of ideas, maybe the kind of invocation of textiles that Nazreen was engaged in. So she was an artist who, while she was based in India, she had this sort of very, I suppose, very kind of wide scope in terms of her influences. I mean, she probably wasn't aware of Lydia Pape's work, but she did meet Carl André in I think in 1973 in Delhi. She wasn't aware of the work of Agnes Martin until sort of later in her career, but again, there are very strong resonances with an artist like Agnes Martin. I think that one could also say that despite the fact that she was very much an artist who was kind of had a studio practice, she did engage with an experience of nature. So in her photography, which she didn't consider to be really part of the work that she would like to show, she would make walks on, she was very interested in seascapes, desert landscapes. She was very interested in a kind of attention to nature. So, for example, one of the forms that reappears in her work, one of the figures is a sundial, and the kind of sort of slow changes of light and shadow that occur over time. She also, in her teaching practice, would base a lot of her work on observation. So the students were invited to sit outside on the campus at Baroda and look at forms in nature and not actually draw them, but discuss them as a group. So it was very much about kind of trying to heighten a sensitivity to the natural world. She was also nomadic in the sense that she was a very cosmopolitan person and traveled extensively in her life. She was, as I said, she trained in Europe, but she also traveled to the Gulf states where her family had a business, and she traveled to Japan and to the United States and to Indonesia and to Iran. And there are a very interesting series of photographs which catalogue these trips. So I think in a way there's a very interesting, with her work, there's a very interesting kind of combination of this idea of stillness and movement. And in fact, I think if you look at the previous work, you can see that she's an artist who, you know, took the sort of the static aspect of the grid and then undermined it with diagonal lines that produce a sense of movement in the image. And then in the second work, yeah, you can see that it's sort of perhaps influenced by constructivism, notions of technology. And maybe I should just show two of the images from the exhibition. This was an exhibition that I curated with an Indian curator called Suman Gopinath, called Nazreen Mohammadi Notes, and it was a sort of encapsulation of some of the aspects of her work. And it was commissioned by the Office of Contemporary Art in Norway. And in the show, we included drawings, photographs, also notations that she made. And it was very much, I think, a part of, after the documenta, where I think her work was seen by a lot of people, but just only one specific aspect of her work. It was really about kind of laying out other kind of aspects of her work and making that more available to audiences.
Thank you. That was great. Catherine, sorry not to put you on the spot, but just to give a few thoughts to...
Well, it is a little bit on the hop. I must say, when people ask what the attraction of Latin American art and the continent, partly I think it's Latin, and a lot of it's escaped the British experience, particularly in the last 20 years. So although galleries like the Signals Gallery that Guy and Paul Keeler and others instituted and had terrific exhibitions of Camargo and Clark and Odesica, for a long time the artists who went to Europe from Brazil and Argentina and Colombia and so forth, Mexico, went to Paris, I think, much more, sometimes to New York. So it's a kind of hunger for something that isn't there. And at the Whitechapel, when I began programming in 1989, the first show that I could put in the program was Tunga. And then when I invited Francis Alice to show in 1996, in January, I asked him about other ideas of artists from Mexico. And he said, well, the exhibition I think you should do, and a lot of people in my generation think you should do, is Francisco Toledo, who's one of his most recognizable images, and he has many more things than this. It's on the screen. Say the first exhibition I did was Tunga. There are, I think, two more. The next two images. One is one of his early Borda drawings on silk, and these sort of hermaphrodite, homogenized male-female images. And then the next one this is from the mid-'80s, 85. And then the next image is a very, very difficult, intentionally difficult work to see, but extremely beautiful in reality. This is a phanograph, and it's a sort of a palm tree and a person. And I've put up these images partly, there were many, many other exhibitions at the Whitechapel of Latin American artists like Cuica and Alfredo Jar, and Cuban artists like Los Copanderos, and it was a program which had Siqueiros in the 30s. It had a heavy Latin American content. But I'm interested in one trend, which is, I think, to begin the story of Latin American art with some of the travelers, and Tanya's really interesting essay takes that point. Some of the people who are taking topographical or botanical or sort of anthropological information in a drawing format. And then to light on from art from the 50s onwards on the things that are most sort of linear and without color, without any kind of subject matter of sort of street observation, or when I was listening to the description of Nazreen's exhibition, which I saw the version in Milton Keynes last year and was really taken by it. But when you think of her in Baroda, you also think of artists like Bhupen Kakar, whose work is so strong in his fantasy world, in his love life, in his organic his pictorial life. And I do think there is a sort of fear or an antipathy toward imagery which is also very much about indigenous culture, and sometimes, in the case of Tunga, about some of the same concerns. He's a little bit younger than Artur Barrio, but some of his work takes certain of the same points of roots. I think of Flavio de Cavallo, not just from his on the street when he's dressed up and walking, but I also think of him making a beautiful drawing of Georges Braque on his deathbed, and some of his more orthodox traditional work. So as we talk a little bit, I just am, it's just a little jolt that we don't look only at the sort of more diagrammatic, filtered, drawing put through a projector, or drawing put through a scanner or a computer, or taken down to a kind of architectural rendering. But we also think of the other part of Latin American art, which is often about, kind of extremely intellectual. It always puts me to shame of the amount of reading of philosophy or ancient Greek, the ancient Greek philosophers, and how superficial sometimes the British layer of knowledge is. But anyway, I'll stop now.
And yes, to make sure that you're not let off the hook, can I ask you a question relating to sort of some of the ways in which you explained how you put together the exhibition last night, and for some of those who weren't here. You described how the collection that you didn't play a part in acquiring, making the acquisitions, but then sort of had the task to sort of present to make sense of to an audience. And it seemed to me that the way you did that was to sort of dance around the fact that the collecting policy was rationalised to a certain extent about different, through selecting different centres. I think it was Los Angeles, London, Glasgow, Düsseldorf, Berlin, New York. So pretty kind of the main commercial centres in the main. And so you presumably thought quite a lot about this as a sort of governing principle and the relationship of an artist to place. And it seemed decided to, at certain points, engage with that in the exhibition and at certain points sort of ignore it. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Certainly. On one level, it was the collecting principle that was sort of most strongly stressed by those who put it together. Even though in many ways it didn't register as making any sense, or it didn't register as kind of containing any narrative surplus value in the actual works when you were grouping them together. In a certain way, half the show was a show about New York, because about 300 of the 650 artists were from New York. So you could make the argument that anyone who wasn't explicitly from somewhere else sort of ended up being from New York. So, but at the same time, you know, I mean, I remember an anecdote where we were approached about, you know, there was a conversation broke out about the respective value or the respective merits of Jasper Jones versus Ellsworth Kelly. And somebody said, well, you know, I think Ellsworth Kelly is the far superior artist because Jasper Jones is an artist who merely has local, you know, is of local interest to New York. And somebody in the museum said, well, you know, we're just a local museum in New York. So, you know, you could spin that argument in that way. But I think what I tried to do is I tried to understand to what extent those centers were selected not as commercial centers, but as creative centers, as basically places where artists congregate. And thus, you also have to qualify those centers kind of not geographically, but also chronologically. The fact that Cologne and Düsseldorf predominantly were centers in the 60s and 70s, whereas Berlin really only started to become one in the sort of second half of the 1990s. The same with the relationship between, say, London and Glasgow. There was a very specific point when that all of a sudden emerged. And I think the collectors were at pains to say that because the process was so quick, because it was finished by 2005, certain other places that just around that time were sort of starting to emerge as real creative forces, such as Mexico City or, you know, Beijing or Shanghai or something, or, you know, certain parts in other places in Asia, actually were completely left out because they were sort of, they weren't quite yet seen from their perspective in that way. I basically navigated the problem twofold. I wanted in the exhibition catalog really cast a light on what the exhibition was about, which was a different structuring principle in many ways. And the catalog raisonné that documented the collection as a whole with everything, I focused more on these kind of 6 geographic structuring characteristics because they're more legible if you look at, you know, all 2,500 works as opposed to the 300 that were selected. So I commissioned essays that were almost sort of biographies of the city or of a certain artistic life in the city from 6 authors that were locals there to kind of talk about, you know, Cologne in the 60s, Berlin in the 90s, London and Glasgow during Cool Britannia, and you know, sort of these sort of trying to figure out what is it with these artists, also specifically with that artistic generation, that we identify as people from that place. You know, how do we think of kind of Richter to Kippenberger as being grounded in a specific locale, whereas, you know, the Berlin artist of the late 90s is a very different kind of animal, whereas, you know, the sort of, I don't know, Angus Fairhurst, Douglas Gordon bubbles are, you know, yet again very specific, kind of culturally specific, but also temporally specific entities. And so it's, I think I tried to navigate it partially by deflecting it into writing about it as opposed to spelling it out. And it ended up, the only room that ended up being geographically specific was Los Angeles, because it was also the only room where almost all the works made by the artist had a reference to Los Angeles, either as a city, California as a landscape, or the idea of the West as a very specific idea in the American mythology. And so it seemed appropriate to kind of highlight that as geographically specific.
And was there, I mean, a sort of governing principle or a thread? I mean, I'm interested in this, to maybe talk about Nicolas Bourriade's idea of the Alton Modern, his sort of proposal that artists don't have roots at all, or certain artists obviously, and that sort of move between cultures and put down their roots where they want. And I guess, yeah, I wondered if that was sort of fed into your thinking in terms of making links between artists regardless of where they were from, but more through the work and their sort of interests. Or if you have any interest in that Nicolas idea.
It's funny, somehow Nicolas has seems to have a very good capacity for finding the term for whatever kind of, you know, conversation seems to be bubbling. And yes, I have to admit, I in this specific instance, I used Nicolas Bourriade's concept of post-production more to talk about an earlier moment of collage and appropriation as opposed to this, because there also isn't enough kind of non-Western material in the collection to effectively talk about a kind of, you know, sort of globality of different languages of modernism. I'm very interested in these kind of problems, and together with colleagues we talk, you know, a lot basically about the sort of the different temporalities of certain modernist discourses as they carry across, both as a historical problem and as something that can be noticed in contemporary practices. It reminds me more of, and Nicolas is, you know, reminds me more of a problem that I first noticed, or that I first discussed with colleagues a couple of years ago, I guess in like around 2005, 2006 at one of the Istanbul biennials, where I read, you know, in the biographies of the artists, and I realized that of all the artists who moved away from their places, everyone who moved from a non-Western center to a Western center still was listed as lives in Paris and Bamako, lives in London and Lagos, whereas those who came from Western places and moved to non-Western places were perfectly content to say, you know, born in Munich, lives in Istanbul, born in London, lives in Recife, or something like that, you know. So as a Western artist, you no longer had to demonstrate your tie to your country of origin through dual citizenship or dual residence. Whereas as somebody who came from a non-Western place somehow had to still retain that as part of their artistic identity.
I think that's a very...
But it's also, well, I just want to say that it is also a marketing tool. And I mean, I remember when Mona Hartoon's selection of work from MoMA's collection was on, and looking at the posters, which said, a Palestinian artist's view of MoMA's collection. And of course, to us in Britain, we thought, wait a minute, you know, Mona was educated in this country, and that's where her studio is, where she's working. It's sometimes in order to add the exoticism to the formula. You know, I don't remember, you're too young to have gone to the Havana Biennale, but the Havana Biennale always made sure that every participating artist was as exotic and as non-Western as possible. You know, no matter, even if they had been living in Amsterdam since they were 15, they were somewhere, they were something else.
Oh, no, of course. I mean, also.
I think, yeah, and I think it's relevant, this question of the curator proving that they're as nomadic as possible as well. But do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think this ultra-modern concept is really problematic, and it sort of describes a very complex situation in which people have occupy different roles and sort of, have different levels of agency. But what I was interested in was this question of geography that came up yesterday in relation to curating, making exhibitions. And sort of, the value of that, to focus on a particular location, but also the possibility to think of other ways of showing work that isn't defined by geography. And I was thinking today, for example, I was very interested in the presentation, the first presentation, this the kind of motif of textiles that came up in Leja Pape's work with this piece called Weave in the early wood blocks. And then thinking about Nazreen Mohammadi and the relationship to textiles that's implied in her work, or someone like Sheila Gowda, who works directly with textiles. So to think about kind of other trajectories into practice that doesn't sort of pin it down to a particular place, but doesn't deny its material connection to that place.
I think that Nazreen Mohammadi and her relationship to a sort of particularly Western modernism and then to the sort of her Indian context is sort of a very interesting example. Yeah, I think,
you made a good point about Nazreen in the sense that the work is very filtered and it travels easily. I mean, it's a practice that, of course, people immediately respond to, they recognize it, but it does connect to its Indian context, I think specifically through design. So she was very connected to design and architecture, urban space, these kinds of things, which at that time could be connected to, sort of Nehru's 5-year plans, the whole kind of social economic development that was taking place in India. So I think that sort of material connection to a place is not always necessarily something which is explicitly articulated. I mean, it comes through, it kind of seeps through in layers.
But would you agree that?
I'm not even sure if we need this.
I don't know. I just say, would you agree though that curators, and I'm guilty of it as well sometimes, filter out something they think is going to be a bit too ethnic, too embarrassing, too, if I think of in Baroda, Ghulam Sheikh, or as I mentioned, Bhupen Kakar, there's, I don't know if it's going to be okay. It's too image-laden.
Well, I think I agree with what you say in principle, but I think that those examples actually have had great success. I mean, Bhupen Kakar has had, big retrospectives in European museums, which, Nazreen hasn't had, but definitely I think there's a question of aesthetic languages that travel and don't travel. And there are certain artists that, for example, certain Indian artists that I've worked with, and when I did the research for Documenta, I didn't actually, in the end, take the curators there because I thought this is just not going to, they're not going to get this, And I have tried, I did a show in Cologne, in fact, with an artist called Valsan Colleri, whose work is very, very unreadable in a kind of Western setting. And I did it in this kind of rather chic Cologne gallery, and the response was absolutely, people just left. I mean, they kind of walked out of the opening, this is not art, So I think that there's a really important job in terms of trying to translate those works. But it's very complicated because you also have questions of audiences and your institutional kind of responsibilities, and yeah.
I'm keen to make sure that we do have enough time to open up to the floor, and if there's no questions, I'm sure we can continue this dialogue. But does anyone want to enter the debate or ask any questions to the panelists?
Mohammadi, Mohammadi.
Last bit, H-A-N.
Mohammadi, E-D-I.
E-D-I.
Yeah.
I'd like to believe that there's a sort of transnational language in art, that enables us to communicate. But I'm partly here because my daughter-in-law is Brazilian and has lived with us for 4 months and speaks better English than my son. But she makes me feel very foreign in a funny sort of way. It makes me aware of my oddity and my tiredness to Northern Europe, and where she's Southern Europe strained through Latin America. I wonder what you're feeling about, how possible it is really to communicate between cultures.
Is that sort of an extension of what you were talking about, how to present the work, represent work when it's in a different culture? Is that?
I think that, there are points of affinity. I think it's the problem of one of the problems I think with bringing work from one place to another is this thing of, okay, this is the kind of Indian Agnes Martin, or this is the Brazilian so-and-so. And everything has to be kind of then pinned to a kind of European, American template. So I think that these affinities meet in a very unequal way. But I think there are affinities, and I was quite interested in some of the things that people were saying yesterday about how there was a move from collecting work from, say, for example, the United States, and then starting to collect from Latin America, and perhaps that was kind of built on certain affinities that could be seen between artists. Of course, artists move as well, so there's the whole, you mentioned signals and this sort of movement from Brazil to London to Paris, and certain kinds of cross-pollination that takes place. But I think there's another side to it, which is that I think sometimes the kind of biennial culture can present this as a kind of an easy kind of coming together and sort of reconfiguring of an aesthetic language which is transnational, that sort of papers over, much more complicated and difficult situations that exist geographically.
And I think also gaps of knowledge,
Yeah.
And I mentioned, I think, one has to really accept that British education, our experience here has huge lacuna in terms of what we've learned about, and so it's intimidating sometimes because you've missed out, and then that's the problem when it's piecemeal. Just you take one little slice of a country's history and you haven't seen some of that sociological, political jokes, everything.
Does anyone else want? Ellen?
Well, yeah, it was just a question to you about your idea that Mona Hatoum's reference to herself as Palestinian, or the MoMA was using it as advertising. I could see I remember Seal Floyer being upset in the 2003 Venice Biennale because she was referred to as Pakistani, and clearly she's based in Berlin, and but Mona, I think, she is based in London, but I don't think of her as having, her career really happened for me in New York. And you really became, she sort of was able to project out of London. She's not part of the YBAs. Maybe she could,
she's
maybe
older
she.
than the YBAs. That's the reason why she's not. But she is part of it.
But I think that her holding on to a Palestinian identity is more than just advertising. I think that's a little glib.
But I'm no expert on this, but on a very practical level, in the case of Mona, it's an artist request for self-identification.
Exactly.
It's simply like, it's Lebanese of Palestinian, British Lebanese born of Palestinian, or
but I don't think
it's how she wants to be listed on the label. It's just as simple as that.
And even if she is British, as you said, oh, she's British, her studio's here.
Well,
I don't know what did she feel so totally integrated in? I'm not sure if she is identifying, she's sort of pointing something out about how she wants to be framed, and I don't think it's necessarily advertising. That's all I'm.
Okay.
Just
well, maybe it's the way the poster. So it's not Mona, and I respect what you're saying about Mona, because obviously.
Because I just remember her as being somewhat apart from her British contemporaries in some ways, and there was a reason that places like Berlin and New York functioned for her as kind of places that she could project her work outside of London.
Do you want to respond?
Well, not to Mona Hatoum. I sort of wanted to respond to what was said earlier and to what Grant had listed, because it brings me to an issue that I sometimes find myself sort of having to struggle with, which is almost a level of that relationship between a kind of self-editing and an external editing within an artist's career, which of course then already relates to exactly these questions of, what is acceptable to be seen as the progressive side of an artist's career versus the traditional side of an artist's career. An example I'm thinking of is sort of if we look at, say, Felix Gonzalez Torres and Leo Nilsson as two people who are like almost exactly parallel in their tracks, in their the subject matter that very much was sort of at the core of their practice, but also in how basically a movement from another place to New York shifted to some extent their practices in very specific ways, and how the work that happened before that is sort of avowed or disavowed based on the position from which the work is viewed. That sort of, from a New York perspective, Leo Nilsson's work before he arrived in New York is sort of 280s and strange, whereas the work afterwards is acceptable. And in the case of Felix, sort of everything that happened in Puerto Rico, and that sort of ties into a Latin American print tradition of popular posters and mass production and newspapers, is sort of very specifically not even listed as work. It's taken out of the catalog raisonné, is not accepted, is completely sort of disavowed. And Elvis Fuentes did a beautiful show a couple of years ago in Puerto Rico, which traveled to the Museo del Barrio in New York, kind of only highlighting that aspects of Felix's career. And so there are these, even within a particular artist, without even having to talk about ultra-modern global issues and so on, we can see these lines of demarcation play themselves out.
Like Flavio is a painter of Cavallo,
right,
or he's a performance artist.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about individual artists, actually, because that really focuses the conversation in a way that sort of more generalized discussions can't. And I'm thinking about Sheila Gowda, who's an Indian artist who I work with. And I did a solo show with her recently. And we had a lot of discussion about how she is described. The first thing she said was, I just don't want to have this kind of ethnic stuff written about my work. I'm sick of it. Every time I have a show, it's about the references are to do with kind of, artisan labor in India and, kind of Bindi. And she's like, this is not the beginning of my work. And yet at the same time, she would refuse to have those things evacuated from her work. So it's actually like a complex thing. It's not like yes or no. It's like you just have, this practice is very complex. It has many components, and some of them relate to a particular place, some of them don't. And it's about somehow respecting that, And I think the bigger projects become, the more difficult that becomes, actually.
I was born in Colombia. I often be presented as a Colombian artist, but I grew up in Barcelona. So for a while, I said about myself, I am a Colombian Catalan artist. After 10 years living in Peru, some critics, local critics, told me, okay, you are now a Peruvian artist. So at the end, I chose recently to present myself as a foreign artist. Yeah. Which is maybe better because everybody is a foreigner, no? At the end, or an alien.
Catherine, would you like to?
Yeah, on this issue of transnational representation, it's a question perhaps more for Christian and in a way perhaps for Catherine also. You pointed out yesterday in your talk that the MoMA only has one regional curator and that it is the Latin American curator. What do you think about the display of this Latin American art? I know the policy has been very much to show it alongside Western art, but don't you think there is also some benefit in singling out in sort of a pointing out certain trends in such as in an exhibition such as this, rather than just having everything disappear in one big display at the MoMA?
Yeah.
It's a fascinating question, and it's one that ties into a much larger discussion that is going on inside the museum right now, which not only touches on the question of national geographic representation, but also the sort of more fundamental segmentation of the museum in departments structured by medium. So if you go to MoMA, and most people aren't even aware of that, if you go to the 4th and 5th floor, what commonly is referred to as the Museum of Modern Art, you're actually talking about the departmental collection galleries of the Department of Painting and Sculpture. Then there are departmental collection galleries of the Department of Architecture and Design. There are departmental collection galleries of the Department of Photography. There are departmental collection galleries of the Department of Prints and Illustrated Books. There are departmental collection galleries of the Department of Drawing. Then there are departmental collection galleries of the Department of Media and Performance Art, and 2 theaters where the Department of Film is showing their films. Most people rarely set foot in all the other departmental galleries, and certainly do not understand that they are, in their mission and in their position in the museum, exclusively dedicated to showing the collections of the respective departments. And we have 3 other galleries where temporary non-collection exhibitions are displayed. None of that is communicated to the outside. So the decision to insert Latin American art into the various collection galleries is a result of the sort of very particular structure of kind of everything, every part of the collection is separated by department. And then what you point out of saying it disappears into the various rooms is in a way actually a response to a 10-year fight of not wanting to, basically when the Curator for Latin American Art started, the idea was, basically somewhere between German Expressionism and the Mondrian room, we're going to carve out a small room, and then you can do like a rotating Mexican muralist show, and then you can show, Brazilian concretism, and then you'll make that just sort of the room where we show that. And it's taken a number of years to basically work through the argument of saying that doesn't do anything. It's actually much more interesting of showing Lygia Clark, Willis de Castro, and Alejandro Otero in a room with Max Bill and Piet Mondrian than it is to kind of, make a Mexican muralist room. But we've had shows where, for instance, we just took 3 galleries and said, okay, we're going to show recent acquisitions of the last 10 years of all the work that we acquired from Latin America, just to sort of give also an idea of the scope, of the scale, of the internationalism, of the kind of material, from video to sculpture to drawing to painting to anything in between. So, but that question and this sort of perception of like, is it meant to disappear? Is it meant to integrate? What kind of canonical art history is told or non-canonical art history is told is one that we're struggling with continuously because we have these funny divisions in sort of collection and non-collection galleries structured and organized by department. And it comes out of the fact, interestingly, excuse me when I'm digressing, it comes of the fact that the first 4 departments of the museum, painting and sculpture, photography, architecture, and film, had 3 disciplines that at the time that they were established weren't even seen as fine arts. So they needed their own departmental galleries because they were seen as having completely separate histories. The history of photography is not a history of fine art initially. The history of architecture has, tangential relations to fine art at best. The history of film is completely separate. And it was assumed that they were modern disciplines, but not ones that could be explained within the context of fine art. And out of the history of the museum, you have these kind of parallel trajectories that we're now, as a new generation of curators is coming in, are trying to bridge and connect and play with and rub against and sort of experiment with.
Did you want to?
No, except to say that I mean, there's so much unused territory and curatorial possibilities. I mean, as you're talking, I think, well, I'd like to see Christians, the artist, I'd like to see a room where he puts the artists he responds to most strongly, that really stay in his mind, that he thinks are really memorable, and he forgets about you know, Glasgow in the 90s and
Right.
forgets about the sort of approach that there's a high point for a collection of artists. These might be individuals. I'm putting together an exhibition that opens in December in London, and it happens to have, you know, the connections between, you know, Lucian Freud and Richard Hamilton, who were neighbors in the 50s. So it's part of their dialogue. And, you know, to try to, or it should have de Kooning and Auerbach, who is Auerbach's, you know, artist most important is de Kooning. You know, there's so much areas that are still put in boxes and in kind of textbook narratives that inhibit people from doing very adventurous work. And I agree about there's no reason why an artist shouldn't have self-definition. You know, why not?
Do you, just to sort of wind up, do you want to say anything else on the subject?
Just to add to these two in agreement, really. Yeah, I think the word experiment is a good one. I mean, you know, I think that works are inherently unstable, and I think what was said earlier this morning about, you know, you have to believe in the work and look at the work and give it attention, and that allows for all sorts of kinds of alignments that are not defined by, as you say, kind of place or, you know, political affiliation or art history. Yeah.
We've left drawing slightly behind, but I think that was a good conversation to have and very pertinent. And I think there's more to be said about how notions of drawing, as came up again in Christian's talk yesterday, are also in the process of being deconstructed and fragmented and etc. But I think that will come back after lunch, particularly when, as Grant rightly suggests, we focus on individual artists, particularly those in our exhibition. But I'd like to thank our panellists, that was great, and also for our audience for coming and attending. Do you want to do housekeeping or in terms of...